Welcome to the Energetic Psyche, hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week for episode 26, I have Dr. William Schaffer with me to talk about his work as an archaeologist and the connections to spirituality he discovered during his digs in the Caribbean. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so welcome to the Energetic Psyche, hosted by yours truly, Dr. Adrian Campbell. This week for episode 26, I have Dr. William Schaffer with me to talk about his work as an archaeologist and the connections to spirituality that he discovered during his time in the Caribbean. So I want to share a little bit about Bill. Besides the fact that we met when we both served in the Coast Guard, which is like 20 years ago, kind of blows my mind. But since then, I'll just go a little bit about everything. How about that? Dr. William Schaffer's life is molded by his experience in sports, military service, academia, and cooking. William has 15 years of experience as an archaeologist in several parts of the world, including Egypt, Ghana, and the Caribbean. He is a research affiliate in the Center for Bioarchaeological Research at Arizona State University, where he also earned his PhD in anthropology. He earned his MA from the University of Arkansas and BA from the University of Massachusetts, both in anthropology, the latter as a summa cum laude with distinction as the Departmental Book Award recipient. He has been a part of grants funded by the National Science Foundation, Sigma Psi Society, and Explorers Club, and published in top journals such as the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences and Science. Nowadays, he works as a financial professional at a Fortune 100 company and a competitive chef. So, thank you so much for joining us. As I mentioned, we met in the Coast Guard almost 20 years ago, which again is wild that it's been that long. But life just keeps trucking, right?
Yes. I mean, we definitely met each other in our younger, sprier days.
Yeah.
But now that we are seasoned, and it's still great to have our connection. And I want to thank you for inviting me on your podcast and joining you to talk about some of the things that I've done. And I'm just so proud of you that you've used your PhD to such a great extent to reach out and, try to get the word out and talk to other people about your craft.
Thanks, Bill. I appreciate it. I know, we mentioned earlier, there's at least 2 PhDs that came off of that boat, which is kind of crazy, right? It's wild. I think people often focus on military services being the highlight of your life or whatever, but there often can be so much more. We just have different phases that we go through. So I am really excited to hear about your journey and how you got into archaeology. When we did finally reconnect and I saw what you were doing, I was like, what? That is wild. And I don't think I told you, but I actually considered anthropology. When I first got out, I was on the fence between psychology and anthropology. And I kept going back and forth. And then I gave up and went into electronics. Because it paid well for a while, and then naturally led into psychology. So that was obviously my path. But yeah, so tell us about you. Where do you come from, and how did you get to where you are?
Well, I think I was born in the Midwest, and I spent a lot of growing up in Illinois, and then my father with his job, he started moving all over the place. And I'm a third generation service member. We just had Memorial Day. Thankfully, my grandfather and father, they survived World War II in Vietnam, and it was always something to think about. And I probably was not the best student at first, and I needed some discipline. And
as a kid? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. As a fledgling, younger person trying to find answers to things, the military was the option that I thought was the best at that point. And then I liked the Coast Guard because it was a life-saving type of service. Right. Yeah, that was a big focus for me. So, and of course, we all thought about jumping out of helicopters. But
as we all do,
you got to be really good for that stuff. So
yeah.
So I ended up being a yeoman, or I think he called me a pencil pusher. And
Yeah, that's one of the things.
Yeah. So I decided to do that because I had done 2 years of college before I went into the service. And, they're just, the service was something that you can make of for yourself, and, including the 9/11 or previously the GI Bill. So I used that to complete my master's degree. I finished my bachelor's while I was in the service. When I was stationed in Boston was my last station, and there was like 30 colleges in that area. So I found one, and I got into anthropology because it was so different. The military was so regimented; it had lots of rules. Anthropology was more, hey, let's explore, learn more about others, not be judgmental. And so I think I was searching for something that maybe created a balance or allowed me a little more freedom. And a lot of times this happens when you have a good teacher.
Yeah.
Dr. Michael Gibbons, he's my friend on Facebook. He can get plugged here. He's retired. Really good teacher. I mean, one of those that fills up the board, chalkboard at that time. And I was blown away how much information and what anthropology could do, how you can make connections with other people. Because the key at the end is, do you want to have positive culture contact with other people that have different viewpoints? And I think now more than ever, especially in the United States, it's very difficult to communicate with others that have different viewpoints because some of them are so opposing. And so that allowed
in a
me
really polarizing time.
Yes. Yeah. So I think that allowed me to, and still, because anthropology is supposed to be non-judgmental, then you should also be using that in your daily life and not just studying in books.
Right. Absolutely.
So I did that, and then I learned that if you wanted to be taken seriously, a lot of times in this field, you needed to have an advanced degree. So, matter of fact, there's a lot of archaeologists that work for what are known as cultural resource management firms in places that are culturally sensitive. For example, I live in Phoenix. If they start digging in Phoenix for a new hotel or something over a parking lot, archaeologists have to come in and actually excavate areas to see that there's nothing culturally significant or super important that we could find underneath that would tell us a lot of answers. So
then do you get excited then when they're going to build stuff and start digging?
In some ways, right?
Yeah.
If they're doing that, one thing is a lot of archaeologists want to preserve everything. We just don't want people to touch anything. And we know about real estate is location. Some of the places I've been, people have been living, like Damascus, city in Syria. People have been living in continually for 10,000 years.
Right.
Underneath somebody's house is an archaeological site. And so there's got to be like this delicate balance. We can't tell everybody, hey, get out of here so we can excavate this place and say, this is my home. What are you doing?
Right.
But I do get excited to hear about people that are doing it. And if I can get down there, I might take a look at it.
Yeah, might as well.
So I did that for, I want to say about 15 years. And then, the same kind of thing happened. I was searching for something else that would, work for me and creativity. So, I moved on from that, and now I'm in finance, and I'm a competitive chef. So
the different paths that we take, right?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people now, they don't have the same job their whole career anymore. They have multiple jobs. So I think it's only a natural progression to do that, as well as academia is pretty grueling. You have to always kind of come up with new ideas. You have to be pushing the envelope, and that can get exhausting.
Yeah, it's a very competitive world. That's for sure. Yeah. And, and I think like just that like brief story you just shared is a really good example of allowing for your path to change and allowing for the unknown and those spaces of liminality to influence, where you go and what you do. Because I think too often we get stuck in these mindsets of like, well, especially, I would say, especially if you have academic degrees in a specific genre, right? Then it's like, oh, well, I've committed all this time and all this energy and all this effort to this. So now this is what I have to do for the rest of my life. Even if you don't like it, right? And my first academic degrees are all in electrical science and electrical engineering, because in the Coast Guard, I ran weapon systems and radars, and then went into semiconductor, and then teaching electronics and nuclear and all of that jazz. And a lot of people thought I was totally nuts when I was like, yeah, I'm going to go study psychology now and like do energy healing and help people. But it's definitely where I'm supposed to be, you know? And if in 10 years that changes, that's okay too. Like, I think it really comes back to the fact that we're here to experience and live our lives, not just go to work every day until we die. But it takes courage to be able to do that, because it can be really scary.
Yes.
Yeah. So during your time as an archaeologist, you like blew right through that. You're like, yeah, 15 years I did this. Tell us kind of like some of the stuff that you did, because I mean, we've chatted a little bit about it, and we decided we're going to do 2 episodes, right? One on your work in the Caribbean, which is this episode. And then you'll be back in a little while, I think a couple months, and we're going to do one on Egypt, which I'm like super stoked about too. But during your time in that space, that 15 years, like, where did you go? What did you do?
This is a great question, and I'm sorry I just kind of glossed over it. But
no need to apologize.
But yeah, I got my BA at UMass Boston, and then I threw out a few resumes, and I started working in Miami as an archaeologist on a very large site right in downtown Miami, right along the Miami River, where we know a group of indigenous people known as the Tequesta had their capital. I mean, even Ponce de Leon interacted with these people. And the firm I was working for also had work in the Bahamas. And I specifically focused on bioarchaeology, which is the study of like human bones and context. So I had take classes in osteology and human gross anatomy. And so you're an expert in human bones. Typically, I can identify human bone from animal bone as long as it's at least the size of a quarter. And that's pretty good.
Yeah. No kidding.
Sometimes sometimes those are big decisions, because if you're working with a development firm, they're going to have to pay the money. But yeah, one time, on a site in Miami, somebody came up with this human. Yes. Are you sure? Yes. Right. This is like 50 grand, Bill. You're going to have to tell these developers. And yeah, I think they found 4 more graves over there. So I was confident in what I was doing now.
Good.
and so was my boss I was working for. And he said, well, let me take you to the Bahamas. I think you're talented enough to go into this cave and really make a big difference. And that's what we did. So we went into the back of the cave, that is one of the most famous caves in the Bahamas, on the island of Eleuthera. And we made a really big discovery that, probably will stand the test of time for the next 50 to 100 years in terms of its like implication. And
so the one we're going to talk about today.
That's the one we're talking about. Cool. That one kind of put me on the map.
Okay.
But at the same time, I was like, okay, well, I got a bachelor's degree and I made this big discovery. And now how are you going to be taken seriously? Well, now you need to get some advanced training. Matter of fact, when I talked to my advisor, Jerry Rose at Arkansas, when I first met him, I was telling him all this cave stuff. He's like, why'd you come here? I was like, well, I need some degrees so that people will listen to me. And
Isn't that crazy? You're like, I know things, but I need the letters behind my name so that people go, oh, that person's smart. Oh, yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is part of that, but at the same time, like going through that, I probably would not have some of the ideas that I'm going to explain to you. It actually helped me kind of enhance because I was forced to not just study bones. Anthropology is a broad field that typically is divided into a few segments. And so they were like, you can't just study bones. You're going to have to read about, ethnohistory and ethnohistoric account of people living with others and learning about them. You're going to have to also, learn about archaeology. So it was good, but it's a long, drawn out process, and it can be very challenging. So
as somebody that has the PhD as well, like, I'm not trying to downgrade it. Don't get me wrong. I know we don't do it just for the letters. I honestly did it for the work, and I'm still surprised at how much the letters mean to people. But it shifts the way that you look at things, the way you study things. I mean, for me, it just really made me realize how much I don't know about the world. And the more I learn, the more I realize I don't know. And every answer gives me 10 more questions. And I think maybe I've always been that way. My parents would probably say yes. But yeah, it really does change, I think, the way that we consciously interact with the world is moving into that type of research.
Yeah, I've also had people say, good research say that when you get through, a bout of research, then you should actually end up with more questions at the end, because you're not going to know everything. And some people assume, PhD, you don't know it all. Or I've gotten that one too. And it's like, actually, we don't know enough.
Right. There's always more.
I'm here as an expert in learning. I mean, and the PhD tells us more, not necessarily how smart you are, but resilience.
Absolutely.
And your ability to solve a problem. Like when I was doing my dissertation, I said, I need to learn. I got to use this other statistical program. My advisor was like, okay. And I was like, but I did because you already have the capability to do this. You've already been in the training. You can do it. You just need the confidence to go through it. And I learned that program and did a great job.
Yeah, I had a friend tell me once that they knew someone with a PhD that shared with them that having a PhD doesn't prove that you're smart. It proves that you're dedicated and you can stick with something.
Yes.
And absolutely. I was like, that rings so hard for me because I am very much an achievement-oriented person. It's like work, get the thing, ding the bell. Work, get the thing, ding the bell. And with the dissertation, I mean, it took me 5 years for my work, right? And I think like multiple times, I was like, I'm done. I can't do it. This is too hard. And I studied grief, right? Grief, depression, suicide. I mean, vicarious trauma, horrible, terrible, deep stuff. And so many times I'd try to walk away for like a second and then be like, all right, you can do it. Shake it off, take a walk, get back to it. And it was like the first time that I like really, really stuck with something for that long. And so whenever someone is like, I'm thinking about getting a PhD, I'm like, let's talk. Like, how bad do you really want it? Because you really gotta want it.
Yeah, and I agree with you, even for the right reasons. I didn't do it for the alphabet soup after my name. I didn't do it because I wanted people to call me doctor. I did it because it was like, if somebody wants to do this as a profession, and unfortunately academia is driven in that way. You see it more in other parts of the world where people get jobs based on when they went to school. And at the same time, if you don't have a PhD, the first thing someone's going to criticize you for is that.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's tough that's the way the world works. But that was the reason I did not. I agree, and I think anybody who wants to do one, you have to want to be able to do it for the right reasons. Because, I spent some of my best earning days as a poor graduate student.
Right.
You really, really have to do it.
You really gotta want it. So let me ask you, because you work in archaeology, but your degrees are in anthropology, and I know they are not the same, besides the fact that they're different words. So tell me why you decided to go with anthropology, even though your work is mostly in archaeology.
So this is a good question, and can be answered by the way the structure of the American school of thought is taught in the field. So there was a guy named Franz Boas at Columbia, and this was at the turn of the 19th, early 20th century. And they said, hey, anthropology, it's the study of humankind. Well, that's a lot of stuff, right? And when you talk about holistic approaches and holism, Franz was thinking, well, I think we need to divide these up. I think we need to have one where it's biological. People are studying the bones and evolution. We need one where it's archaeology. People are digging stuff. We need people that are, sociocultural, that are going to live with a group of people, learn about them, because if we're going to build a highway or something like this, what are we going to do if this land is super important to them? The USAID and does stuff like this. And the other one was linguistics, which is kind of a dying field, because many modern anthropologists, well, if I'm going to communicate with another group of people, probably should learn the language. You probably should be able to do that. And I've done that in some parts of Africa, and as well as when I was in Egypt learning Arabic. It makes a really big difference when you communicate with other people. So in the United States, almost every degree that falls in archaeology that's kind of conferred is anthropology. There are some places where the departments are separate, like Boston University. I don't know why, but they have archaeology and an anthropology department, which you know how academics fight. Now, if you get a degree in Commonwealth country, England, Great Britain, Australia, South Africa, New Zealand, you could get a degree in archaeology because their school of thought is structured slightly differently. But then you can also run the danger of getting something very too specific, like we talked about. And then how are you going to broaden that if you need a shift in employment or something?
Right.
So yeah, that it kind of answers that question, I think.
Okay. Awesome. All right. So I totally tore you off track. Back to Arkansas, I think.
Okay. There we go. So we make these big finds and we started presenting them. And matter of fact, what we're going to go through is one of those presentations. And I sent out a bunch of applications. I got waitlisted at Ohio State. I got into Florida State, and I got in Arkansas. And the advisor I was talking with, I thought he deserved it and I did to work with each other. And so I got my master's there, and my advisor there, I was like, oh, Florida, Caribbean, look at all this stuff. He's like, you're coming to Egypt with me. And I said, okay. All right. Yeah. So then my focus, I was still working in the Caribbean and publishing and here and there, because it was a pretty big find, and it generated a lot of published material, because the material was so well preserved. We have some of at the cave in the Bahamas, we have some of the most complete DNA that's ever been found, and it's used in a lot of reference studies as a point with other, because you can't use DNA if you don't have anything to compare it to.
Right.
And then I finished at Arkansas, got my master's, and then I got into Arizona State University, which is one of the bigger schools for archaeology. And bioarchaeology as well. My advisor there, she kind of coined the term. So I got in that school, and I was like, this is really good. And that's other good advice for the people that want to get a graduate school and go on. It's typically the top tier schools that people get jobs.
Yeah.
So that was kind of my thinking.
Right.
And then I did my master's and PhD on a site in Egypt. And then after that, I served 5 years at the community colleges here, both as a professor and a department chair, until around the time of the pandemic. And I was part of the kind of the Great Resignation. Some of it had to do with online school, right? I wanted to be in the classroom. Yeah. I don't really like teaching online, and students email you all the time. So I was like, I don't know about all this. It's a big change.
Yeah.
And I saw other people kind of making the transition. I said, yeah, I think it's something I would want to do.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, cool. And so today we're going to be talking about the work you did in the Caribbean. and we have a slideshow. So if you're listening on Spotify and you want to see the slideshow and you want to see the pictures, you got to go find this episode on YouTube. But if you're here with us live, you get to see it all right now. And I'll also say, like, the reason that we even decided to bring archaeology onto this podcast, right? Because it might seem a little odd, is because when Bill and I were talking, you were sharing with me about people's beliefs back then, about spirituality and just how practical they were, right? Like worshiping the sun, and how there's a lot of modern day religions that would make fun of that. And it's like, yeah, but they're literally studying something that you can see right in front of you. So I was really excited to kind of bring this forward as another way of understanding and looking at how people interact with spirit and spirituality based on their culture and their perspective in the world and all of that. Yeah. All right. So let's get started with the Caribbean. Let me get this keyed up here. Dun, dun, dun. All right. Here we go. It's all yours, Bill.
Thank you. So this is a presentation that was done probably a little over 10 years ago at the Society for American Archeology, and this material is published in the International Journal of Osteoarchaeology, as well as a book known as Sacred Darkness by the University of Colorado Press. And Dr. Campbell and I talked a little bit about it. If anybody wants access to some of that material, I will do my best to get it to them. I think I have both of the free copies.
Yeah. So just reach out to me at the end of this. If you guys want research papers or whatever, just send me an email, reach out to me, comment on the post, and we'll get you what we can.
Absolutely. And this is a map of the Bahamas, the Bahama archipelago, and that's where I did most of the work, which is, some people say, is not quite part of the Caribbean. It's part of the North Atlantic. Just north, you can see Cuba. You can see parts of Florida in the upper left-hand corner. But here's the islands of Bahamas, and there's, little dates in red, right? This is after, after the death of Christ, 700, 800, and 900 AD. That's when we think people arrived in those areas. The Caribbean and the Bahamas were the very last places in the world for people to occupy and actually get to, besides some of the islands in Polynesia. I think the Maori in New Zealand are fairly recent. So people get there at about 700 AD in the Turks and Caicos. They get to San Salvador about 800 AD, and somebody else gets to San Salvador, but a little bit later, in 1492. Matter of fact, that's where we think Columbus landed on that island. They created a fort, and they started communicating with the native people known as the Lucayans. That's what has the title up here. Indigenous people of the Bahamas. They called themselves Lucacari, or island people. A lot of indigenous people, they just call themselves people in their language, and sometimes it's the European people that gave them a name, and that kind of stood the test of time. For example, the Navajo out here, they actually call themselves Dene. Navajo is the name that was imposed on them. So in this case, we actually use the name, and archaeologists sometimes do this. If you find a group of people 10,000 years ago, well, who are they? They might just kind of make up the name for that culture with the attributes and the artifacts that are found. Right. In this case, we know that this is what they called themselves based on historic documents, Columbus and his diary. Matter of fact, his diary, it did not survive. We only have an abstract from one of the Spanish historians 50 years later. So some of that's a bit fuzzy.
Gotcha.
Columbus lands in San Salvador, and he notices that these people live in small villages. They are island people, meaning they had seafaring vessels. They would go from different islands. They had salt, and they also had cotton, so they could trade They could trade with other people. And the Caribbean, we think now, was a kind of a place where there was lots of interaction. Columbus finds out that people have gold, and he asks them where they get it. And they find out that there is a more powerful chiefdom on the island of Hispaniola, which is modern-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. And that's where he goes next. We think that the Lucayans are descendants of the Arawak, who came from the Orinoco River Delta in Venezuela and started exploring into the Caribbean, getting to places like Trinidad and Tobago, then to Puerto Rico, and then to places like Cuba in this area. So a bit of a long journey. And then, of course, Columbus, he enslaved these people and brought them to pearl mines in Venezuela. And then he headed to Hispaniola, where he did see them actually have gold. And, hint, hint, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, there's no gold in the Caribbean. Zero. There are silver deposits on a French island called Martinique, and that's it. But where'd they get it? Got it from the mainland in Mexico. And that was, you can see, was the next surge with people like Cortez and Pizarro. We could go to the next slide where it talks about kind of their spirituality. And before he got to Hispaniola, and this would happen during conquest and conquistadors, they would send a friar out or a priest, and they would go live with the people, learn their language for the most part to conquer them. And some friars later were like, why did you do this? That's not what you were supposed to do. But you think about it, these are probably the first anthropologists. It's the first people that are learning their worldview, learning how they tick and what's most important to them. Well, this friar, his name was Ramon Panay, and he wrote a volume that you can still get today. It's with very recent translations. And in there, I kind of, just given us the main points of what he recorded with them. One of them is that every human group or society has their own creation myth. And for them, it was that their people, originated from one cave, and anybody else that was not them was a different cave. They were known as the Taino at that point, but they were the powerful chiefdom, and they actually expanded. We think that the Lucayans actually were absorbed by the Taino, that they called themselves kind of Lucayan Taino after a certain amount of time. And it's probably because they had a lot of caves. Some Caribbean islands don't have a lot of caves, but we think that it was probably a fluorescence like of this religion and this belief system that, of course, caves are the birthplace of humankind.
Right.
Not just our own people, but other people.
And this is that belief is common to many different societies across the world, right? Not just here in the Caribbean.
I think, like in terms of caves,
yeah,
I think there are a large group of different peoples around the world that have this belief system. In the Sacred Darkness book at volume, and the editor, and we agree with her that caves. Many people think caves, Neanderthals, people living in caves. What we're laying down is people don't live in caves. I mean, yeah, we probably went in caves when we needed to because of some bad weather, some bad stuff happening. But what we learn mostly is they are sacred places. They are places where you are communicating with the underworld. And you also see this with caves in parts of Europe and Africa with Paleolithic people. You've seen some of the drawings of animals and hunting, right? They're not living in there. I mean, those are messages, right? They show how people are living. They could be instructions to kids. And so caves have this long-standing relationship with humans, not just, in the past, but even today. I mean, you go into caves, right? It's dark places. There's places, bats fly everywhere. You don't know what's around the corner. And so generally what we noticed with caves is we saw a lot of that's what we call sacred darkness. It's usually the dark part of the cave where people bury things. People put things that are really important. And it's because of its importance being, the birthplace of humankind, but for these people and others as well, like you so aptly put, is the sun and the moon originated from caves. And they worshipped like a group of deities, some that are more overarching, larger ones, and then smaller ones that are more accessible to common people. And they were done in twins, males and females. And when people started living with some of the groups that were seafarers in Amazonia, they noticed that they would worship certain groups or zemis. Zemi is just basically a deity, and here's one of them in its wooden form. And so we would find them all over the place, as well as the belief systems that were recorded. Man, the book is called The Sacred Zygote. But this person lived with Amazonian groups and listened to them talk about what the world was like. And one of them is that if you think about it, the water is blue and so is the sky. And so these people believed that they were completely surrounded by water, which is not a terrible thing to think. The same wavelength is created, same color I see. And so we're encased by water up in the sky and down below.
Well, and especially down there, because the color of the water is much more similar to the color of the sky.
And especially in some of those areas which are much more shallow. You're absolutely correct. The native Bahamian people, they lived in very shallow reef systems. They had very nice crystal clear water. It probably almost exactly nice and light like the sky. Yeah. And to them, caves were the midpoint. Everything you got the water in the sky, the water down below, and both kind of heavenly, right? And then caves right in the middle. And so we've got land, we've got water, we got sky. The caves were the place of the underworld. It was the way you could access both of those two areas, and a 3-tier universe. That's kind of what is mentioned in anthropology in the field. You see it in other places. I can take you to some petroglyphs out here in Arizona, and you will see a very clear kind of 3-tiered component to some of their drawings. And we think that's a major part of their spirituality and their belief systems. There was one specific cave that they believed was the house and dwelling place of the dead, that you had to be placed in the cave for you to gain access to the underworld. Just like somebody today says, well, they need a proper burial. What does that mean? Right. Well, now that's like in the ground or cremation, because if you don't do that, what happens to your soul? You may not have access to some of the things other people do in the afterlife. And they did just recently find some Lucine burials on a beach, and we're trying to understand what that means, because we've always found them in caves. Does that mean that there were people that weren't afforded the afterlife, that they were buried there to prevent them from getting there? So
is it possible they washed out of the cave?
Yeah, lots of ideas. I can't remember what the authors tried to. I think they did try to do something like that, Adrian, like trying to find an explanation why they weren't in there and buried there for eternity, and how they kind of got up on the beach. It could be things like erosion that happened.
Yeah.
But if you think about it, it's the caves and Earth's surface that allow them to gain access to, the birthplace of humankind, the sun and the moon. I mean, it had to be a really eerie feeling for them, just like we do, entering a cave, but with much more, prominence, where this is a very, very sacred and important place. And it also afforded a lot of respect.
Well, and I'll say, I've been in many caves, and there is a heaviness energetically when you move within them, right? And I think part of it definitely is just moving deeper into the earth, like Mother Earth, like from a spiritual and energetic perspective. But there's just this thing that exists. It's like entering into a field. It's almost like when you dive into a pool of water and there's like a pressure against your skin. For me, going into caves is like that energetically. It's like there's a pressure against, my energetic body or against my skin, because it is different. And I do, like I said, I think it's so interesting as you see these types of things play out across so many different cultures all over the world. Creation myths and how similar they are, beliefs in the heaven systems. At one point in my life, many, many years ago, I studied a lot of different religions because I was like, what's the answer? I want to know the answer. So I studied and read and read and read and basically was like, no, it's basically all the same thing. Like, we're just like going about it using different rules or different ways of looking at it based on our perspective, where we live, and what works for us societally or culturally.
So yes, I completely agree. There's a general mystique of caves. They're part of the unknown. I mean, if you go into a cave, you don't even know where you are on the surface of the earth. You can't even really pinpoint yourself. Are you underground? Am I above ground? I don't even know. Right.
Right.
Yeah, it causes lots of, how do I want to say this? Lots of external stimulation.
Mm-hmm.
That is both exciting and something we don't necessarily understand.
Yep. And we're just over halfway, so I want to make sure we get to your actual dig.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we can move pretty fast for these.
All right. So here we go. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. Generally, we have two types of cave systems,
Mm-hmm.
and some of them are underwater and submerged. Some of them are dry, caused by waves crashing into limestone from the sea. They're close to the shore. We're not sure if people buried them in places where it was already submerged and underwater, or if the water tables kind of rose a little bit more. What we do know is when seawater and freshwater interact, it causes fissures and creates a more complex cave system. So what we know right now is you can explore both blue holes or wet caves and dry caves and typically find Lucaian artifacts inside them.
That is crazy.
Yeah.
So like lots of them?
Yes, I think just about every cave you could find maybe some pieces. A lot of them had been looted over time, both the artifacts as well as for gathering guano to fertilize some of the fields for grain to actually make rum. And so dry caves are a little easier to access, of course. Wet caves are not, because a lot of times you're going to need some type of scuba gear or equipment to get down there.
And I remember when you shared the bat thing with me, I thought that was so interesting because bat guano is especially useful for what?
Yeah, for rum. I mean,
rum.
To make rum and the grain. And matter of fact, if you look at Bacardi, there's a bat on top of the bottle cap, and that's because of the influence of bat guano as a fertilizer.
Oh my God, it's crazy.
A fun fact in there,
I mean, I focus on the important stuff. Okay.
There you go. Well, one of the most famous places where there are blue holes or wet caves is on the island of Andros, of South Andros, and there are two specific caves. You can go to the next slide. Sanctuary and Stargate Blue Hole. Human remains were found there by cave divers, and they also found a canoe. And this is what it looks like in all its beauty and grace. It's not in the best, best preserved because it's been underwater, and wood decays really fast. It will break down and crack. But what we know about the canoe is this would not be very useful in the ocean or the sea. And this is also what we see with lots of burials. Sometimes people are buried with what's known as a blank, meaning it's like an axe that was never sharpened. And it was made just to put in the ground with you. Gotcha. And so with that type of analogy, we think that this was a canoe made just for this a specific person, and maybe artifacts were placed in it, and they were kind of led into the blue hole. So we do have that variation. I haven't gone in a lot of wet caves. I've swam in some of them, but I haven't dove in them. And I specialized in dry caves, which would be the next slides. These are petroglyphs and pictographs. Okay. We don't have to, it's just kind of like where they are in different islands. This is kind of what they look like, the rendition of here in the corner, but we know that people are drawing on caves. They're drawing on caves, faces of people, what look like animals. And of course, some people might say aliens, right?
They kind of look like aliens. All right.
And then, and that was from the cave in Eleuthera Preacher's Cave. It had little eyeballs, and they modified. They made something out of the variation in the rocks, and it's inside the cave where we found this specific cave in particular. Some of the best artifacts ever buried with any Lucayan person, besides maybe Stargate Blue Hole with the canoe. And it's known as Preacher's Cave here because we know that there are European people that crashed on the reef system. The reef system is known as the Devil's Backbone, by the way. You can tell that doesn't sound like a really good place to be.
And it's near the Bermuda Triangle, right?
It's right. Yeah, it's just south of the Bermuda Triangle. So you had people that were loyalists to the crown in Bermuda, and said, I don't want to pay the king's taxes anymore. And they went straight into the Bermuda Triangle, shipwrecked on here. And in the 17th century, they lived there. And now it's most of the Europeans that live there are descendants of the first people that got there and asked for help from the Massachusetts Bay Colony and Virginia. But before that, and we have evidence of Europeans all through this cave, they carved things out. We think they had sermons. One looked like a rock that looked like a pulpit, but it's in the back, in the very back.
Wow.
Yeah. We started finding a lot of European stuff first. And that's when we told other researchers, let's go in the back, in the dark zone, in the really dark spots.
Yeah.
And guess what we found? We found, the things that are sacred to Lucayan people. That was the front of the cave, but it's in the front. Many Europeans used it in the facade. But it's in the back, in the dark areas, where we started doing surveys, and we found a group of 3 burials that date no more than to about 1300 AD. And of course, Columbus doesn't get there to about 400 years later. And so what I can do is talk about these 3 burials, like this individual. It was a woman, and she was buried on her left side. And you can see right my little circle that I made, there's some discoloration on her bones. Well, this discoloration is because she was buried in a basket. And matter of fact, we had documents from the chronicles, Columbus and all the explorers that were there, that described this very burial practice, that people were buried in baskets. But this is the first time it had ever been seen archaeologically, or their baskets preserved. All we had were basket impressed pottery. They would make baskets, and then they would take their clay and mold around the pottery and then fire it. And then we would see the impressions of the baskets on the inside. So you can see the schematic of the actual basket that's been found on pottery to the right. And this here is one of the cheekbones. You can actually see the weave pattern. I sent it to experts too. They could tell me the very exact weave pattern that was made for this basket. And so we likely think this is a high-ranking female in their village because she was afforded this practice. Yeah.
Nice.
You can go to the next one.
Okay.
There was a burial that was underneath. There was a burial underneath her that was buried face down. We don't know. We think probably the head was removed to make room for her. But this is a male buried face down, and it looked like he was tied up. We don't really know exactly what happened, but some people suggest this could have been a slave. It could have been a sacrifice to some of the more high-ranking villages. A lot of times, historically, what we notice about people that are face down is either if they have a shroud, they just accidentally put them backwards. You see that in parts of Egypt. Yeah, you made a mistake.
Oops.
But this looks
people mess up.
This looks more purposeful, and this person has no basketry impressions on their body, which might mean something different socially. And I think there was a researcher that looked at face down burials, and I think generally she just said that people who are buried face down, okay, one, mistake, two, they're social deviant, and we don't want to afford them the same type of underworld access as others. We don't want them to come back and haunt us. And there are other indigenous counts, even with native peoples of Nebraska, that did things like this.
Well, and I don't study a lot of archaeology, but I read a lot of fantasy fiction, and I know that cutting off the head is one way to make sure that they don't come back, right? Like zombies, bad guys. That's what we do.
And there was one other thing is that people had trophy skulls. They would cut off the head and take the skull with them. And we know the Aztec had huge skull racks in front of their villages, just to let you know, hey, you try some funny business, you're going to be on the rack.
Right.
Other people, based on the counts of the friar I was mentioning earlier, as well as other documents in the chronicles, it wasn't uncommon for people to have bones of ancestors in the home, like a skull on a mantle. Yeah, that's my great-great-grandfather. Okay. Some people buried individuals underneath the floorboards of the home because they wanted the ancestors to be very close to them. Some people had buried them right outside the backyard because they wanted to have a walkway so they could interact with the ancestors. Whereas you can see it's totally taboo.
Right.
For modern day to really do stuff like this.
Well, but even in certain situations that we were talking about is by placing them in the cave, that gives them access to the underworld, right? And giving a proper burial gives them access to the afterlife. And so if you take parts of their body and put it in your house or whatever, And
this is also some common beliefs like the ancient Egyptians did. They believed that, of course, with mummification, that you would take other pieces out because the king going to need it in the afterlife.
Right.
Well, they removed the brain and threw it away. They thought the brain was the heart. So what does that mean? You got the pharaoh in the afterlife and he's got no brain. He's got everything else. How is he even functioning? And so if you think about it, this person is in the afterlife without their foot bones are gone. We couldn't find them and their head's gone. So great. You get to be in the afterlife, but you don't have a head or you don't have feet, right? So there also is that thinking that, oh yeah, you don't have access. And if you do, you're only going to have a few different pieces of you in it.
Right. Yep. All right. This next one I think is my favorite.
It's the showstopper.
Right.
Well, we believe this person was probably very high ranking, and you can see it. And the other individual that had basketry as well, you can see that they're staining on parts of the face and parts of the shoulder. The basketry impressions weren't as prominent. They were decayed much more. And you can actually see, do you see the person's head is a little bit slanted here?
I was going to ask about that. Like the shape of the skull and their head, it looks different than most human skulls I've seen.
And Columbus mentioned this. Columbus actually mentioned that their skulls looked different than ours. And this is something you see all over the Americas. It really only probably see it in some parts of Africa. But this characteristic almost exclusively in the Americas, parts of Peru, parts of even the United States, Native people were doing this. They would wear a headdress when they were younger and it would kind of modify the shape of their skull.
Interesting.
Some other native people, and even Dene Navajo out here, still do some of these practices where, what are you going to do if you got to move as a mother? You carry the kid on a backpack, and you can't just put the kid on a backpack and have the kid's head go like this.
Right.
They had to do something to stabilize it. And so some people suggest that either it's a headboard during childhood during transport, or it's a type of headdress that was worn over time to do this during development, because this doesn't happen during adulthood. This had to happen when they were a child, which also means that they were probably chosen at birth for the role that they have in their village. Right? See how many kind of connections we can kind of breathe into and maintain. And there was a pit around this person. They actually had a grave pit that showed that these artifacts were with them. And one of them is a Triton shell, which is a predator. This is not a queen conch shell that lives along the reef that you could probably go dive really quickly and grab. These live like 20, 30 feet underwater. So somebody had to go a lot of effort and to actually get this, because they hunt starfish and stuff like this. And this shell is typically made into a horn. You lop the top off, which is closer to the bottom, and you blow through it. We actually found some in the cave. I wasn't very good at blowing the horn, but local people were really good at it still. I was like, I can't make this sound. That's the cool thing about archaeology. I mean, we even found something made of a deer bone on a site in Miami, and somebody said, "Oh, it's a flute," and I was like, "Okay, time to play the flute," right? Because you can't, and maybe it's not a flute, right? It's got to be something else.
Yeah.
So you can do experimental stuff, but here's the thing: is it wasn't lopped off like a horn. And matter of fact, if you want to get this out of the shell to eat it, you have to break the muscle, and the part where the muscle is broken off is not there. But they created this huge. That is cut. You see the hole in it? That is cut. They made that cut without industrial equipment.
Right.
In a shell. I don't even know how they did that. Right. And then behind them, right in the back, and I think there's a closer shot of it. Yeah. This was really neat. It actually had some staining on it, but it had a number of different components to it. So there was about 28 shells that are called sunrise telling shells. They have little rainbows on there. And there was a piece of red ochre, which is iron oxide. You find a lot of that there, but you don't find it in the cave. Not at all.
Right.
And then there's a tiny piece of fish bone in there that was polished on one side, meaning somebody used it. And it was sharp on one end. And we think it was probably mixed with oils to make tattoos on their body. And so if you think about it, 28 shells exactly, that's the cycle of the moon. The sunrise telling shells, right? They're known as sunrise because of the little rainbow, or it looks like little auras. Is this something else that ties their death and access to the afterlife, as well as the beginning of the universe? An ode to the sun and the moon, the birthplaces of both humankind as well as all celestial bodies, right? That's probably the great significance. And as you mentioned in the beginning, right? What's the point of worshiping things like the sun and the moon and the sky? Well, indigenous people thank their creator, the creator, every time they wake up, every time during the day. They thank the creator for the land that they're on, that it can be used. And they're thanking all the other celestial bodies, which one would argue are actually real things than, maybe some type of deity.
It's much more practical, if nothing else. I mean, more realistic and more practical, because the sun is definitely giving life, and the moon does move the oceans, right? And the lunar cycle matters. I mean, yeah,
for many reasons. And I think maybe, right, and this all ties into, right, energy. And maybe it's better for us in some ways spiritually to really recognize some of these real small things that we take for granted now. And now, of course, you recognize the sun when you're driving, and you have to put, put the little thing down and be like,
The
oh,
visor
yeah,
down.
I'm acknowledging you, son. But maybe it's more like, in Phoenix, we get a lot of sunlight, right? A lot of sun, but
Yes.
maybe
Mhm.
acknowledging the sun, acknowledging the sky, acknowledging these components that we assume are going to be the same every day, and there's going to be no change, and we're going to be fine. Maybe it's something that will bring you closer to your own spiritual fulfillment.
Yeah. On a light note, I noticed just the other day that I was like, we're just not getting enough rain this spring. This is going to be a problem. And 10 years ago, I never would have thought about something like that. But after traveling as much as I have through different ecosystems, after seeing what a wet spring does for the rest of the year, I notice the effects of these things. And traveling to places like Colorado, where, at 9,500 feet, you are literally closer to the sun. And it doesn't seem like that big of a difference, but it is. Like, it is a huge difference. The atmosphere is thinner. There's less oxygen. You're going to sunburn a lot quicker. I think sometimes we're so stuck inside and in such an artificial life these days that we don't pay any attention to how the sun, the moon, the weather, etc., is connected to us and impacts our lives, because we try to control it all, right?
When it's drowned out, right? We have lights on that create artificial light even at night, and
Right.
it drowns out our ability to look at the sky. And most observatories are at altitude because it gets rid of all that, they call it light pollution.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, you have a good time at 10,000 feet in Colorado, you probably see a lot more stars, right?
Right. Right.
Think about it as just, if you're going to, just simple naivete, it was like, well, if I want to be able to observe them, or I want a greater spiritual kind of, journey or stimulation, you would go to those places at altitude.
Yeah.
If you want to just even observe certain phenomena.
Well, and camping for me is always like a sleep routine reset, because I don't keep my lamp on all night long. At home, I'm usually a night person. I stay up until like midnight, 1:00. But when I camp after the first night or so, I'm usually in bed by like 9, 10 o'clock. And I wake up way earlier because my body starts to adjust to the cycles of the earth, right? And I don't know. It's nice. It feels good. And maybe being home, I do it so I don't have to be near as many people. I don't know.
Well, and you also don't, you're not going to have cell phone reception. So
Right?
you're not getting the artificial light from the phone, which messes up our whole circadian rhythm.
Right. Everything is just a nice reset and a reconnection. But
absolutely.
Yeah.
Which can be great for your psyche as well as your libido.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. So we are just about at time. So I'm going to wrap us up. I know time flies when you're having fun every single time.
We did good.
I know. Really good. So I just want to say thank you so much for joining us. Learned so much stuff as always when I do these. And I'm really excited to have you come back and share about Egypt as well. And I know that, like, just as a reiteration, if anyone's interested in any of Bill's published papers, just send me a message or write a comment on the post, and we'll make sure to do our best to get you that. And I guess the one thing I always say at the end of every show is, if there was something that you wanted everyone to know, what would that be?
Ooh, that's a really good question. What I want everybody to know is that every group of people on this earth has their own specific identity, but at the same time, they are part of the human story, and they have different components to answers that you may not have. So I think humanity as a whole, each belief system has a little bit and piece of us, and that's what makes us great.
Oh, I love that. Absolutely. I feel the exact same way. Awesome.
And we should highlight those things, right? Everybody says, hey, I'm different this way. It's like, let me find out about that. Let me learn about that. Let me be able to think about things to help relate with you.
Yeah. Curiosity and connection, right?
Curious. Absolutely.
Curiosity and connection. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, for everyone out there listening or watching, thank you for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.
Bye, Dr. Campbell.
Thank you for joining us on the Energetic Psyche, a weekly podcast that live streams every Tuesday night at 7 p.m. Central Standard Time. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you have a great week. Take care.